In 1926, Salem, Massachusetts, was a quiet town still shadowed by its dark history. Life there was simple, its rhythm dictated by the rising sun and the whispering woods. Abigail Putnam, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with a penchant for writing, kept a journal tucked beneath her bed. It was in this journal that she chronicled the most horrifying days of her short life. It all began on the morning of August 2nd. Abigail's twin brother, William, left the house after breakfast. He told their mother he was going to the frog pond with his best friend, Richard. It wasn't unusual for the boys to spend hours by the water, skipping stones and chasing frogs. But as the day waned and the sun dipped below the horizon, William didn't return. Abigail remembered the tension that filled their small home as her mother questioned Richard. His eyes darted nervously, and he fidgeted with his hands. "I never saw him today," Richard insisted, his voice barely a whisper. Abigail's father, Elias, didn't press further, but she noticed the dark glint of doubt in his eyes. By nightfall, neighbors had joined the search, armed with lanterns and accompanied by barking hounds. Abigail clutched her mother's hand as they wandered into the dark woods, calling William's name. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, but it carried an unnatural chill that made Abigail's skin prickle. Despite hours of searching, there was no sign of William. The next morning, the hounds picked up a scent. Abigail's heart pounded as the dogs led them deeper into the forest, their barks echoing through the still air. At last, they arrived at a cave nestled among the rocks. It was dark and uninviting, its entrance a gaping maw that seemed to swallow light. Abigail's father held up his lantern and stepped inside. They found William standing deep within the cave, his back to them, his head tilted toward the jagged stone wall. His clothes were dirty and his feet were bare. When his father called his name, William didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. It wasn't until Elias gripped his shoulder and turned him around that he finally moved. Abigail gasped. William's face was pale, his eyes empty, like he was staring through them. He allowed himself to be led home without resistance, but he spoke not a word. The family tried to make sense of what had happened. "The boy's just scared," Elias said gruffly as he paced the kitchen. A night alone in the woods would rattle anyone. But Abigail wasn't convinced. Something about William felt off. He wasn't just quiet. He was detached, as if the brother she knew was no longer there. That night, she wrote in her journal, "It feels like William's body came back, but his soul stayed behind." Over the next few days, William's condition worsened. He refused food and water, spending hours staring out the window at the dense woods. His once lively eyes were dull, and Abigail noticed a strange, rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the table. It was like he was trying to communicate something but didn't know how. On August 5th, Abigail was jolted awake by a piercing scream. She ran downstairs to find William outside in the yard, naked, his face upturned to the full moon. His voice was guttural and raw, spewing words that made no sense. His eyes rolled back in his head as he shrieked at the night sky. Their father rushed to restrain him, and William fought like a wild animal, scratching and biting until Elias managed to carry him back inside. The next morning, Dr. Baker came to examine him. "Physically, he's fine," the doctor said, though his voice was tinged with unease. "But he must eat, or his body will give out." That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. She stayed curled under her quilt, clutching her journal to her chest. She felt a suffocating weight of dread, as if something unseen was pressing down on their home. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden creak. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by the soft scuff of footsteps on the floorboards. Abigail froze. Her heart thundered in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She slipped out of bed and crept toward her parents' room, clutching her journal like a shield. She slid under their bed, her breathing shallow as she heard the steps stop just outside the room. Her last journal entry ended with shaky words. "I can hear them. Whoever or whatever it is, they're here." When the sun rose on August 7th, the silence in the Putnam household was deafening. Neighbors arrived later that morning to check on the family, concerned by their absence. Inside, they found the gruesome scene. Abigail, her parents, and even their dog had been savagely murdered. Abigail's journal was discovered beneath the bed, its final entry stained with blood. But William was gone. Authorities searched for him for weeks, combing through the woods and questioning anyone who might have seen him. No trace of the boy was ever found, and the cave where he had been discovered became a place of dark legend in Salem. The discovery of the Putnam family's mutilated bodies sent shockwaves through Salem. Whispers of curses and witches returned to the town's conversations, resurrecting fears buried since the infamous trials. Yet, the absence of William was what haunted the people most. How could a boy vanish without a trace after such horror? Abigail's journal became the centerpiece of the investigation. Authorities scrutinized every word, hoping to uncover some clue to explain the tragedy. But the final entry, cut short, trembling in its tone, only deepened the mystery. Speculation ran wild. Some believed William was possessed by a spirit from the cave. Others insisted he'd been lured by something older, something inhuman. A week after the killings, an old trapper named Gideon Arkwright approached the sheriff. His weathered face and unsteady hands betrayed a life lived too long in solitude. "That cave," he muttered, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "It ain't just a cave. My granddaddy warned me about it. Said there's something ancient in them rocks." The sheriff dismissed Gideon as a drunkard, but the townsfolk were less skeptical. Rumors spread quickly. Stories of strange lights flickering near the cave, animals avoiding the area, and faint whispers that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. Despite the growing fear, no one dared venture back to the cursed site. Months passed, and Salem tried to move on, though the weight of the Putnam tragedy lingered. Then, on the bitterly cold night of November 13th, a farmer named Ezra Tully came stumbling into town, his face pale as death. "I saw him," Ezra gasped, clutching at the sleeves of a skeptical shopkeeper. "The boy, William." Ezra claimed he'd been gathering firewood near the forest's edge when he spotted a figure standing under a barren tree. The boy was thin, almost skeletal, his clothes torn and his skin ghostly white. "He was just staring," Ezra said, his voice trembling. His eyes were black as pitch. And then, he smiled. The sheriff organized a search party the following morning, but their efforts yielded nothing. The snow-covered ground bore no footprints, and no one else reported seeing William. Still, Ezra's story revived the unease that had begun to settle. People locked their doors earlier, avoided the woods, and spoke of the cave only in hushed tones. Abigail's journal was eventually returned to the remnants of her extended family. Her cousin, a 19-year-old named Eliza, found herself unable to let it rest. Unlike the others, Eliza had spent countless hours with Abigail and William growing up. She couldn't reconcile the boys she'd known, gentle and curious, with the terrifying figure described by Ezra. One crisp December morning, Eliza made the decision to visit the cave herself. Armed with a lantern and a deep resolve, she slipped away before dawn. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow muffling her footsteps as she made her way toward the dark mouth of the cave. Her hands trembled as she stepped inside. The air was colder here, heavy and damp. Shadows danced along the walls as her lantern flickered. Eliza called out softly, her voice swallowed by the silence. Deeper she went, each step feeling like it carried her further from the safety of the outside world. And then she saw it. Scrawled across the cave walls were strange markings, symbols she couldn't understand, carved deep into the stone. Her heart pounded as she moved closer, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. Beneath the carvings lay something even more chilling. A child's shoe covered in dried mud. It was William's. A sudden sound behind her made her spin, the lantern shaking in her grip. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The only response was a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. The light from her lantern dimmed, as if the darkness itself was pressing in, smothering her. And then she saw him. William stepped out of the shadows, his face gaunt and unrecognizable. His eyes were lifeless voids, and his lips curved into a smile that sent ice through her veins. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and rasping. "You shouldn't have come." Eliza stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. "William, what happened to you?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They called me," he replied, tilting his head as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "They've been here for so long, waiting, and now they want you too." Before Eliza could respond, the cave erupted in a deafening roar. The walls seemed to shudder, and the symbols glowed with an otherworldly light. Shadows twisted and stretched, taking on monstrous shapes that surrounded her. She screamed, dropping the lantern, which shattered and plunged the cave into darkness. The search for Eliza lasted weeks, but like William, she was never found. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a series of strange events in Salem. Unexplained fires, livestock mutilations, and sightings of shadowy figures lurking in the woods. To this day, the cave remains untouched, its entrance sealed by a collapse years after the events. Locals warn against wandering too close, sharing hushed tales of those who heard faint whispers in the wind, calling them by name. The Putnam tragedy, the cave, and the chilling fate of those who ventured too close have become part of Salem's darker lore. Some say William still roams the woods, his smile as haunting as ever, waiting for the next soul to answer the call of the cave.